Thank you, David. Thank you to my fellow speakers. Firstly, talking about convergence and divergence, I thought it was interesting as I was looking at the slide, and it suddenly occurred to me that at least 3 of the organisations sponsoring this afternoon can claim US parentage in one form or another. And I wondered if that said anything about the fact that you've got 3 essentially US organisations sponsoring a conference on this topic. And I couldn't decide whether it was because we are more in favour of it or whether it's because we feel more guilty about the situation that we're in. Because I think largely people put Dodd-Frank on the podium when laying blame in this. I'm not necessarily convinced that is fair. So, convergence versus divergence. I suppose the big question is, and I did a straw poll of one person just before we came in, who happened to be having a fag outside. Sorry, Tony. I said, where do you think we are on this? And he said, well, it's more about what do we want? Do we want to see convergence or do we want to see divergence? And which of those is the most likely? So I thought I'd just talk briefly and in doing so, hopefully address Sharon's rather excellent point at David's prompting on the trade repositories. So looking at them individually, convergence, I think Paul made a great point, which is the business of finance, global finance by nature is a more global business than it used to be. We see a lot more interconnectedness between firms and we see a lot more interconnectedness between markets. And that's really where the problem has lain in the past, is that we have seen non-harmonized approaches to resolving problems in what is essentially a global business. So I think convergence of legislation is very important when it comes to addressing those different businesses, but on a global basis. Also, from a firm's perspective, it allows the streamlining of processes because you're only dealing with common regulations, common solutions to common problems. That allows you to reduce your costs and ultimately, I think, allows you to manage your risk better, thereby reducing that risk. Robert talked about the elimination of duplication, and I think that also plays very much to the cost reduction and the risk reduction. If you don't know what you've got to comply with or you're having to comply with regulations twice, then that creates problems, as I said, both of cost and of risk. And it also increases certainty in what at the moment is a very uncertain world. Some convergence, or hopefully all convergence of all legislation ultimately would result in greater certainty in the markets. So what about divergence? We've seen a phrase used in the press of late, which is economic nationalism. And sometimes I wonder whether we're moving down a route of regulatory nationalism, which is people trying to protect their own markets, ignoring the fact that the markets are interconnected and that global solutions are best. I was interested in this regard in Sharon's comment on trade repositories. And if I can just give you a little bit of where we were and where we are likely to be as a result, I think you'll see that in actual fact, we're going backwards in the space of trade repositories. So prior to Dodd-Frank and prior to EMEA, the global regulatory community got together under the banner of an entity known as the ODRF, the OTC Derivative Regulators Forum. And they came up with a set of global guidelines, which I think covered something like 34 different jurisdictions globally and included 50-odd regulators because many jurisdictions have more than one regulator. And this group got together and they agreed on the rules by which the regulatory community would have access to data, exactly the point that Sharon was raising. That allowed my organisation, for example, who has operated the CDS trade repository for some years now, we've got about, we reckon, 98% of the global CDS contract data. We were taken to task over this by the FT about 6 months ago when they announced, I think it was a Friday, an FT Alphaville led with a story which was DTCC says it's got 98% of global CDS contracts. Who says? We don't believe that, and we've calculated it ourselves. much wailing and gnashing of teeth over the weekend while we waited for Monday's revelation, and the FT came back and said, see, they were wrong, they've got 99%, not 98%, which was quite good, we thought. So we've got 99% of the data, and we've got a set of globally agreed rules that all the regulators can access the data, not only the data over which they have direct jurisdiction, so for contracts in their region or for counterparties in their region, but they can also see data on contracts outside of their region, but which have a relevance to their jurisdiction. With the advent of Dodd-Frank and EMEA, that may no longer be possible. So we may actually be going backwards because the regulation is very clear that for the US, Dodd-Frank is the reporting regime, and for the EU, EMEA is the reporting regime, and thou shalt not allow data to be shared across borders. So, as I said, actually we may be going backwards, and that, I think, is a bad thing, because again, to Sharon's point, the whole purpose of putting together the trade repository community, if you like, was to provide data to stop what happened in 2008 happening again. So we're actively moving backwards because of this economics, what I would call regulatory nationalism. We see a similar unintended consequence, I guess, from here in the EU with regards to EMEA. And EMEA, for example, will require the DTC's entities in the US, our settlement clearing entities, to be recognized under ESMA, by ESMA under EMEA, in order that we can provide clearing and settlement facilities to the US domiciled branches of EU banks. Now, a prerequisite, as I understand the legislation, of us achieving recognition is for ESMA to agree that the US jurisdiction is congruent with the European jurisdiction. I see and hear a lot of people saying that there is a lot of work going on in this regard in order to get the convergence between those regulations. But to me, it's a bit like an iceberg. The bits that I see above the surface are the bits that say we're not going to achieve this convergence. And the bits below the surface, which everybody assures me are going on, that the regulators are talking, that the politicians are talking, I don't see those. I'm not privy to those discussions, so I don't know where they're up to. And I'm afraid I'm a bit old-fashioned, and I believe that I believe what I can see with my own eyes. And I am sort of thinking back to, last year was 100 years that the Titanic went down. The Titanic was sunk by the bit of the iceberg that nobody could see. That worries me. So, politicisation, I think, is a big problem. And I think the brinksmanship that we're actually seen to be engaged with, particularly between the EU and the US, is dangerous. And I think we need to, everybody needs to put, I'm a bit of an idealist in this regard, we should put our cards on the table and we should aim for global solutions. And I know it's very easy for me to stand up here and say, let's go global. But I actually believe that is the truth. If only for one reason. I'm going to leave you with a well-worn quote from Sun Tzu, which is, keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. We need to converge the markets in order to provide global solutions to what are essentially global problems. Thanks.